하나님이란 말만 해도 그것은 북한에서는 세상에서 가장 나쁜 사람들은 예수 믿는 사람들이라고 했고, 또 선교사나 목사들은 양의 가죽을 쓴 승냥이들이라. 신앙을 가지게 된 것은 저희 남편 때문이었습니다. 이렇게 해서 아들이 와서 아버지가 기도하라고 했고 예수님을 믿으라고 했다고, 우리 아버지가 믿는 예수님도 좋은 분일 거라고 해서 그때부터 우리는 기도하기 시작을 했습니다. 이렇게 아들이 손을 잡아당기고 거기다가 예수님을 믿어라. 예수님은 눈으로는 볼 수 없지만 예수님 확실히 계시고 일을 하신다. 북성대에서 감옥에서 안기부 간첩으로 몰려가지고 그 복음을 전하고, 밤에는 몰래 복음을 전하고 아픈 사람 기도해주고, 그러면서 이제 거기서 그렇게 그 사역을 할 때 하나님께서 그 사람을 통해서 그 감옥에다가 지하교회를 세워주셨어요. 저희 남편은 정말 나는 이제 죽어도 천국이 있다, 천국 소망이 있기 때문에 이제 죽어도 나는 이 세상에 아쉬울 것이 없다고 그냥 그런 이야기를 했다고 그래요. 감옥에 있을 때 특히 감옥에서 정말 많은 사람들이 옆에서 죽어가고, 항상 주님께서 내 마음에 기둥이 되고 내 마음에 등대가 되어주시고, 나의 목자시니 내가 부족함이 없으리로다. 만한 물가로 인도하시리로다. 나의 영을 소생시키시며 자기 이름을 위하여 의 길로 인도하시리로다. 내가 사망의 음침한 골짜기로 다닐지라도 해를 두려워하지 아니할 것은 주께서 나와 함께 하심이라. 말씀으로 나를 위로해 주시고 힘을 주고, 내가 거기서 정말 무사히 나올 수가 있었고, 하나님 은혜로 그래도 신앙의 자유가 올 날이 있을 줄로 믿으면서 항상 정말 그 날을 기다리는, 인내하면서 우리가 주셔서 감사하고, 그래서 항상 이 노래를 부를 때마다 자꾸 이렇게 눈물을 흘리게 되죠. 주님 은혜가 너무 감사해가지고. 나 같은 주 은혜 고마워, 이 받고 광명을 얻었네.
As our introduction, and it's going to be uploaded on the page if you want to share that video by itself. Guys, through the World Watch List 2020 pamphlet, I was working on a PowerPoint, so I'm just going to show you guys the source material instead of what I was working on, and we'll get through that. And yeah, So this is the Open Doors World Watch List pamphlet for 2020. They send one out every year. There should be another one coming out the end of this year. And Open Doors is a nonprofit underground churches and give people Bibles and discipleship material, as well as food and clothing and water and things that they need. It's really, really close to my heart. So much so that I've signed up to be a connector with local churches. I'll be reaching out to some churches here soon, trying to get some of this information put in the church bulletins and on their websites, and as well as sharing it here on the live stream. So this is the World Watch List. What we're going to do is I'm going to go through all 50 countries, and then I'm going to read the prayer point, and I'm hoping that you guys can just watch this and keep these people in your prayer. You know, it really puts things in perspective about how blessed we are to be in the situation we are and be able to proclaim Jesus' name and have this live stream over the internet. It is truly a blessing and a gift. And as long as we got it, we're going to rock it out. So I'm going to go through this, and I really ask that you guys keep these Christians through. All this is kind of an overview telling you what I just told you. Here we get into, it says 260 million Christians experience high levels of persecution in the top 50 countries on the World Watch List, and that's a 6% increase from 2019. Christians killed every day for their faith. 3,711 Christians were detained without trial, arrested, sentenced, and imprisoned. The worst country, all these are listed in order from most persecution to no persecution of Christians, are not on this list. So we need to pray for all of them. Here's North Korea. They've got these little profiles. So there's a difference in pressure and violence, obviously. There's about 300,000 Christians in North Korea. The main religion is atheism. As you know, it's a single-party dictatorship. We are going to pray for endurance and courage for Christians who are suffering right now in labor camps across North Korea. We're going to pray that continued diplomatic efforts will result in religious freedom for the underground church in North Korea. And we're going to pray that God will reach Kim Jong-un and top leaders in North Korea with the power of the gospel. Here's a map of the World Watch List. Some of these things you're gonna be very surprised about. So we've got here North Korea is the worst. Surprise, surprise, down there in extreme persecution is India. A lot of people believe India is a very developed nation. And then down here we also have Russia sitting at number 46, which might surprise some people. China's at 23. Kenya's at 44. Yeah. Okay, number 2, we have Afghanistan. We're going to pray Christian converts from Islam face heavy pressure from family, friends, and neighbors. We're going to pray for these believers to have courage and perseverance. The Islamic Republic of Afghanistan does not allow conversion from Islam. Please pray for a softening of the country's leadership and local rulers. We're also going to pray for the spread of the gospel in Afghanistan through secret believers and the underground church. Next, we have Somalia. We're going to pray for the government of Somalia, that its leaders will be open to the truth of the gospel and there will be more safety and protection for Christians. We're going to pray for Somali Christians who often must hide their faith to survive. Pray that they will have courage to stand up in the midst of extreme persecution. And we're going to pray specifically for Christians who convert from Islam, that God will give them wisdom and access to a Bible and discipleship. Next, we have Libya. We're going to pray that the protection of Christian converts pray for the protection of Christian converts from Islam, and ask God to connect them with other believers so they will know that they are not alone. We're going to pray for the protection of migrant workers in Libya, especially for those who are Christians and face double persecution. We're going to pray for a stable government to be established in Libya and ask God to provide religious freedom for Christians. Next, we have Pakistan. We're going to pray about Pakistan is afflicted by numerous radical Islamic groups. Pray for the current Pakistani government to pass laws that will protect the Christians in the country. We're going to pray for the protection of converts from a Muslim background who are extremely vulnerable to persecution from radical groups, family members, friends, and neighbors. We're going to pray for Christians who are accused under blasphemy laws. Ask God to give them strength and hope during their trials and for justice to prevail. Next we have Eritrea. We're going to pray for endurance for brothers and sisters detained or imprisoned in horrific conditions and ask God to give them perseverance in their faith. We're going to pray for President Afwerki and the government leaders in Eritrea that God would work in their hearts and reveal the truth of the gospel. We're going to pray for unity among Christians in Eritrea and ask God to help them see past denominationalism and count themselves as one church family. Next we have the Sudan. We're going to pray for peace and expanded religious freedom in Sudan as negotiations continue between the military council and opposing forces. We're going to pray for Christians to have the opportunity to worship together freely without fear of violence. We're going to pray for new converts to Christianity that they would be able to stand strong and have access to Bibles and discipleship training. Next we have Yemen. We're going to pray for peace in Yemen as opposing forces continue to clash and leave Christians vulnerable. The instability in Yemen has created a refugee, food, and healthcare crisis. Ask God to help provide food, clean water, and relief to the people of Yemen. Pray that secret believers from Muslim backgrounds will have courage and perseverance in their faith, along with access to Bibles and discipleship materials. Next we have Iran. We're going to pray for Iranian Christians who are in prison right now for their faith. We're going to ask God to give them hope and encouragement in their isolation. We're going to pray that God will work through the leaders in Iran to create laws that provide more religious freedom for Christians and minority religions. We're going to pray for secret believers who meet in house churches, that they will be protected and will be faithful witnesses to the surrounding culture. And India, we're going to pray for Christian converts from Hinduism and tribal religions who are forcefully pressured to return to their former religion. We're going to pray for God's power and protection over Christians as they preach the gospel in places with anti-conversion laws. We're going to pray for government leaders in India that they would change their perspective and create more room for religious freedom. We're going to pray for peace in Syria and ask God to relieve the suffering Christians in hostile regions held by rebel groups who oppose Christianity. We're going to pray for critical relief and aid to reach Christians who have fled their homes or lack basic resources in their cities. We're going to pray for Syrian church leaders to have wisdom, perseverance, and discernment as they lead their people and provide hope. In China, I apologize. Next is Nigeria. We're going to pray for Christians who live in constant threat of attacks by Islamic extremists. Ask God to protect them and give them hope and peace. Pray for Fulani militants and other extremist groups like Boko Haram. Pray that God will touch their hearts with the truth of the gospel and they would stop committing, it doesn't say this, but I'll pray that they would stop committing the terrible, horrific acts that they have committed for so long. Pray for pastors and church leaders who are helping rebuild communities and restore their churches after violent attacks. Next, we have Saudi Arabia. Pray for isolated believers all over Saudi Arabia who lack fellowship and community. They need discipleship and a sense of belonging. Pray for Christian Saudis will find ways to share the truth with their own family members. It is forbidden to openly practice religions other than Islam. Conversion is punishable by death. Please pray for Muslim Saudis will come to know Jesus. In the Maldives, official polity dictates every citizen must be Muslim. Pray that God would work in the hearts of the Maldives leaders to change this law, and that God would be working in the hearts of the Maldivian Muslims. Pray that God would lead secret believers to find fellowship with one another and access to the Bible. Local media reports that drug abuse, in an effort to find some relief from the tight restrictions in the country, has become the biggest social issue in the Maldives. Pray that the Maldivians will return to Jesus to experience true freedom. We're going to pray for Christians who are rebuilding their communities and churches in Iraq. We're going to pray for trauma recovery and reconstruction efforts, that God would give peace to believers. We're going to thank God that pressure and violence have both decreased slightly, and we're going to ask God to give His hope to Christians in Iraq. We're going to pray that priests and pastors who are leading diminished church communities will find encouragement for the hard work ahead. We're going to pray that they would know that they aren't alone. In Egypt, we're going to pray for the believers who have friends or family or who have been injured or killed in violent attacks, praying for healing of hearts, minds, and bodies. We're going to pray for the unity in the Egyptian church, that Christians of all backgrounds would see themselves as a common family of God. We're going to pray that God would soften the hearts of extremists and government leaders, and Jesus' name would be known. In Algeria, we're going to pray with the believers who have had their churches shut down. We're going to pray for the pastors, that they would feel God's presence. We're going to pray for Christians who convert from Islam, that they would be protected, bold, and wise. We're going to pray with believers who are rejected by their families for their faith. Pray that God would let them know they have a global family who stands with them through prayer. In Uzbekistan, we're going to pray that Christian converts from Islam would be delivered from threats of violence from their family and communities. We're going to pray with Christian groups who are targeted by the government because they are not sanctioned by the state. We're going to pray for safety and courage. Pray for the isolated believers who have converted from Islam and are unable to publicly express their faith for fear of discovery. We're going to pray that they will find fellowship and peace. In Myanmar, we're going to pray for persecuted Christian minorities, that they would lovingly minister to persecuted Rohingya Muslims, especially those choosing to return from exile in Bangladesh. We're going to pray that many hearts would be opened through the truth of Christ. Christians who convert from Buddhism and Islam live under intense pressure from their families and communities. Pray for them to feel connected to the Church of God around the world. In Laos, we're going to pray that Christians would be able to witness to their Buddhist neighbors and family members, and that they wouldn't be oppressed because of their faith. We're going to pray that Christians in Laos would be able to freely access Bibles and register churches. Pray for the salvation of the communist leaders who try to restrict the church. We're going to pray that Christian children in Buddhist schools would not be discriminated against and given low marks because of their faith. In Vietnam, we're going to pray with the pastors who traveled into rural areas to minister to ethnic believers who have formed small church communities. We're going to pray for believers who leave their traditional faiths to follow Jesus. If Christians are deemed to be politically active, they can be targeted by the government. We're going to pray for wisdom and strength for Christians trying to navigate ever-changing regulations and expectations from the communist regime. In Turkmenistan, we're going to pray the totalitarian regime in Turkmenistan is one of the strictest in Central Asia. We're going to pray that for the church leaders of Turkmenistan to be humbled and know that Jesus is Lord. We're going to pray for believers who are former Muslims. Even if the surrounding culture is mostly culturally Muslim rather than devout, there is still intense pressure from families and communities. We're going to pray for the churches that are monitored by the government, pray for pastors and congregants to be safe and be able to worship with one another. In China, we're going to pray for the church in China as it adjusts to constantly tightening restrictions of religious freedom. We're going to pray for Christians and ethnic minorities who have followed Jesus out of Islam or Buddhism. We're going to pray they would find strength and fellowship. And we're going to pray that Christ will reveal himself to government officials who seek to control the church. In Mauritania, we're going to pray that Christians who are converts from Islam, they face intense pressure from the government, from their families, and from their communities. pray for the problem of slavery in Mauritania. This heinous reality sometimes stems from religious extremism. We're going to pray for the victims of slavery. Pray for the safety and courage for Christians who fear the rise of more Islamic extremists. Pray for the hearts of radicals to turn to Jesus. Central African Republic. Pray with Christians targeted by rebel groups and Muslim terrorists. Pray that they will know God's presence, God's peace, and His provision in the midst of earthly chaos and loss of their homes. Pray for God's protection over Christian leaders and their families as they minister to their congregations in the face of threats and conflict. Pray with new believers who face threats by family members and are ostracized by their communities. Morocco, pray that laws would change, making it legal for Christians to share their faith. Pray for perseverance for new believers from a Muslim background as they encounter adversity. Pray with Christians who have difficulty finding a church building that they would not be discouraged or lose their zeal. Pray for boldness and discernment for believers as they risk persecution to tell others about Jesus. Qatar, pray that the church in Qatar would continue to gather together privately and be strengthened in their perseverance. Pray for believers imprisoned for sharing their faith. Ask God to protect and encourage them. Pray for Christian converts who feel they cannot share their faith with Muslim family members. Burkina Faso, please pray for the Lord's comfort and grace to be at work in the lives of all who have lost loved ones. Pray that Christians would have the grace to remain firm in their faith as they face increased hostility. Extremist ideologies sweeping across Sahel have brought destruction. Pray that the Lord would use these circumstances to display His glory. In Mali, fueled by terrorist attacks, violence against Christians in Mali has increased substantially. Pray for peace and protection. Pray for families who have lost loved ones in these attacks and kidnappings, that they would feel God's presence and know His comfort. Pray with new believers who have left Islam to follow Jesus, for them to grow in their newfound faith and be encouraged as they follow Jesus. Sri Lanka, please pray for families who lost loved ones in last year's Easter attacks, that they would sense His comfort and lean into His strength, especially as they approach the first anniversary of the bombings. Pray for the provision of 176 children who lost one or both parents in the attacks. Pray for protection from any further attacks on churches, and pray specifically for the 3 churches that were bombed. Tajikistan, pray with new believers who live under constant pressure to renounce their faith and return to Islam. Pray especially for new converts who are persecuted by their families. Pray with church leaders who face threats of raids and arrests. Ask God to give them courage, wisdom, and discernment as they serve the church. Pray that governmental pressure would be lessened and that the Christians would be able to practice faith openly in peace. Nepal, pray with converts from Hinduism who experience persecution from their family and community and are at risk under anti-conversion laws. Pray for believers' protection and discernment to know when and where to share their faith. Pray with churches in Nepal as they gather for worship under threat of violence. In Jordan, pray with believers who are discriminated in their jobs, that they would follow Jesus' example as they respond to their persecutors. Pray for protection against attacks by radical Islamic groups. Ask God to confuse these persecutors' plans for violence. Pray for wisdom and encouragement for believers to be true disciples as a small minority in the Muslim-dominated culture. In Tunisia, pray that persecuted believers will sense God's presence in their daily lives as they navigate Islamic society. Pray for Christian converts to grow in their faith. Ask God to raise up leaders who will teach the Bible and plant underground churches. Pray for persecuted Christian youth, especially those who face pressure from non-believing family members when they want to marry. In Kazakhstan, pray for Kazakh believers and for church leaders, especially those pastors who lead secret churches and those believers who converted from Islam. Pray for their security amid increasing restrictions and government control. Pray for converts under house arrest for leaving Islam and turning to Christ. Pray for the government authorities who seek to surpass or eradicate Christianity. Ask God to open their eyes to His truth. In Turkey, pray with persecuted Christians who face an increasing bias against their faith. Pray that they would not give up meeting together and studying the Word. Pray with believers as they look for relevant ways to share their faith with their Muslim friends and family. Ask God to give them discernment and words to minister graciously and wisely. Pray with church leaders for wisdom and boldness as they minister to their congregation and look for opportunities to plant churches. In Brunei, pray for Christians who want to share the gospel but are not permitted to evangelize. Pray for Christians who must worship secretly and at the risk of legal punishment. Pray for churches who cannot import Christian materials, whose services are sometimes monitored. In Bangladesh, pray for secret believers who seek to share their faith despite the risk they face. Pray for Christians who had to flee their communities out of pressure to renounce their faith. Pray for Christians who are mentally and physically abused on a regular basis as they go about their daily routines. In Ethiopia, pray for converts to Christianity who are ostracized and denied family rights. Pray the government will not continue to shift toward more restrictions. Pray God will equip the church to find ways to witness to their neighbors. In Malaysia, pray for protection for secret groups of believers. Pray they would be encouraged and strengthened in their faith, despite the fear of being discovered. Pray for new believers who are often kicked out of their home or may be sent to re-education camps to try to reverse their conversion. Pray for political, social, and religious stability and provision of new religious freedoms. In Colombia, pray for Christians to experience peace and remain strong in their faith, despite the fears of guerrilla activity against them. Pray for Christians who promote human rights and peace, who are often targeted in killings. Pray for pastors and their families to have the support and protection they need to continue to spread the gospel in the community. Oman. Pray the government will lift restrictions on freedom of expression, assembly, and religion. Pray for new believers who are likely to face strong societal pressures. Pray that young people who have increasing access to education may usher in a shift in the climate toward Christians. In Kuwait, pray for Christians and other minority groups who face discrimination. Pray for Christians who may be excluded from community activities due to being seen as foreigners or infidels because of their faith in Jesus. Pray for Christians who may be forced to follow strict Islamic laws or risk being legally or otherwise penalized. In Kenya, pray for wisdom in sharing the faith and in discipling new converts amidst militant tensions. Pray for new believers who may not have access to resources and may be lured away from faith in Jesus by economic enticements. Pray for Christians who have suffered severe trauma in targeted attacks. In Bhutan, pray for believers who violate the anti-conversion law by leaving the Buddhist faith. Pray that efforts to persecute Christians in Bhutan will actually strengthen and unite them. Pray for Christian converts who face strong pressure from family, friends, neighbors to recant their faith. Pray they might be strengthened when facing persecution. Pray that the Lord would soften the hearts of their communities and make them receptive to the gospel. The Russian Federation. Pray the government will cease imposing legislation that restricts religious activities. Pray for the safety of church members when they are arrested and interrogated by the police. Pray that suspicion of Protestants who receive support from foreign organizations won't hinder the process of new churches receiving their official registration from the government. United Arab Emirates. Pray for leaders of the United Arab Emirates to have wisdom and tolerance, allowing citizens to change their faith. Pray that the government will be able to keep the country safe from terrorist groups and provide policies that encourage young people to work for the good of their country. Pray for Christian women who convert from Islam and lose their rights to possessions and their children. Cameroon. Pray with Christians in northern Cameroon who have converted to Christianity from Islam. These believers often face threats and violence for their choice to follow Jesus. Pray for Christians who oppose the dictatorship of President Paul Biya. If believers are seen to oppose the government, they can be tortured and even killed. Pray for the saving grace of Jesus to pierce the hearts of Boko Haram fighters, that they would see the truth in Jesus. Indonesia. Pray for believers who continue to recover from the loss of family members killed in the 2016's and 2018's church bombings. Pray for Christian converts from Islam as they live under tightening anti-conversion laws. Ask God to give them wisdom and perseverance. Pray that God would open the eyes of Muslim extremists and university students exploring radical Islam ideology, drawing each one to himself. In Niger, pray for Christians who live in regions where extremist Muslim preachers are creating hatred against the followers of Jesus. Some Christians have difficulty conducting business or building churches. Pray they would be allowed to live and worship openly. In parts of Niger, Christians who have converted from Islam are heavily pressured by family and community. Pray with these sisters and brothers.